Pleasure to have you on my way. Yeah, what a quartet.
Well, we're a hit. We should quit while we're ahead here. Hi, I'm Terrence McNally. On behalf of the Dramatists Guild, I want to welcome you to our ongoing series of landmarks in the American theater. And first of all, I do want to thank the Midtown Arts Common at St. Peter's Church for the use of the hall, particularly Edmund Anderson. On the way over here today, I was thinking, what is a landmark? And I think a landmark is something we love a lot, something that can never be replaced, something we'd miss if anything ever happened to it. And West Side Story clearly is a landmark in my book, and I'm sure yours. The four gentlemen I have with me this afternoon individually have certainly affected the history of the American theater, musical theater especially, and it's hard to imagine what the musical theater would be like in 1984 without their efforts. I think in our community they are four men we hold in great, great respect and much love for all they've given us, and it's a real privilege to have them here today. Their individual credits would go on forever, the prizes they've won likewise, so I'm going to dispense with all that. But in case you've been under a very large rock for a very long time, that is Arthur Laurents at the end, Jerome Robbins next to him, Leonard Bernstein, and Stephen Sondheim. West Side Story is the one time these four extraordinary talents came together and worked together, and that's very much what we're going to talk about today. And I think all of our guests have done one of these before, so they sort of know the ground rules. And that is what I like to do when I'm running them, is start with the germ of that idea when someone says, hey, there's a musical or a play there, up through, in this case, September 26, 1957, which was the night West Side Story opened at the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway. To the best of my knowledge, this particular seed first was in Jerry's mind. If I'm wrong, correct me, but Jerry, I'd like to start with you. The dates aren't so important, but if you have some, would be great, and how this germ grew.
Okay. I don't know the date exactly. If we got it on in 57, it must have started
49.
49, something like that. Okay. A friend of mine, an actor, was offered the role of Romeo, and he said to me, I don't know about this part, it seems very passive to me. Would you read it and tell me what you think? And at that time I was working also at the Actors Studio, I think teaching there. And so I applied all my knowledge and said to myself, if I had to play this, how would I make it come to life? So I tried to think of it in terms of today. And that clicked in, and I thought, oh, there's a wonderful idea here in trying to make it today. So then I wrote sort of a very brief thing on it, and started what I would call the rounds, looking for a producer who'd be interested and looking for collaborators who would be interested. This was not easy. Producers were not at all interested in doing it, and although I went to Arthur and Lenny, at the time they were interested but not interested in getting together to do one of these things. So we put it away. And then many years later, am I right, they were involved in another musical and then asked me to join them on it. And I was not interested in their musical. But I did manage to say, how about Romeo and Juliet and this? And I won them back to the subject, in effect. Mm-hmm. And that became the beginning of that collaboration. Now, someone else want to pick up the story?
Well, let me ask you, were Arthur and Lenny the first librettist and composer you approached?
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And how long a period from 49 to they got reinterested in you?
Oh, it was years.
50 years.
Yeah. It was a long time.
And you let go of the idea for a while. I mean, you weren't actively seeking other collaborators in that period.
Let me think about that. No, I thought these were the best people for it. I really did. I mean, I think maybe some producer would say, why don't you go ahead this way or go ahead that way? Mm-hmm. And I felt that this was meant for that, mostly because let's take details away, but I thought that there's some way of bringing to the Broadway theater at that time the best of the arts, that what I knew about dancing, what Lenny knew about music, what Arthur knew about playwriting, could be put together and make a kind of show which probably was not as prevalent as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stuck with trying to get these guys, and when they came back to me, I had the bait then to grab them.
And they came back together?
Yes.
Okay. And when did Steve get into the picture?
It was 1955. They had, well, maybe they should take up the story in between. By the time I joined, Arthur had an outline, a 3-page outline, single-spaced, and so it was fairly detailed, and they were looking for a lyric writer. But maybe you should fill in.
Well, speaking of the
Can
lyrics...
I say something,
yes,
Terrence?
Yes, sure.
I think all this should be prefaced. Several years ago, too long ago, Hal Prince wrote his theatrical memoirs, rather prematurely as it turned out. And he, in that, talked about producing West Side Story. He was one of the producers. The original producer, the one who stuck all the way, was Roger Stevens. Then later he was joined by Hal and the late Bobby Griffith, who was a wonderful man. Anyway, I read Hal's recollection, and I called up Steve and I said, I don't think that's the way it happened. And Steve said, no, but it didn't. My point is not that Hal was distorting. He was telling it the way he saw it. And I think today each of us is going to tell it the way each of us sees it. And it's sort of Rashomon West Side Story.
Jerry?
I'm leaving out a lot of details, okay, just to cut through, because there are a lot of producers that we brought it to. Leland Haywood was interested in it for a while. Cheryl Crawford was interested in very deeply, up to the point where we all four here auditioned the show to backers and raised not a cent. We gave it Richard Rogers, we offered it to at one point. I mean, there were a lot of producers in it, and I think that...
And Hal and Bobby had turned it down before.
Actually, I think it was turned down by every single producer in the theater, except Roger.
That's not, don't be,
Almost.
I don't think anyone, the audience here should not be shocked by that. No, don't. A fait accompli is one thing, but a work that is in a state of embryonic procedure and quite radical at the time to what was mostly being done, it was not surprising that people said, I don't understand what that's about. They had not heard Lenny's score. They hadn't seen what was going to be written. They hadn't certainly seen what was going to be danced, although at that one audition for backers, we all got up there and gave everything we could to make it happen.
We all performed.
It was in a room in an apartment on the East River, no air conditioning, and a lot of tugboats.
Windows open and the sound of the tugboats, which was then subsequently used in the shows.
Steve, when we
My
talked
best
about
bar.
when you got involved with the show, part of the West Side Story lore, which I'm sure you're aware of, there are a lot of books that have been written that refer to West Side Story and various what really happened, was that Lenny, you originally were going to do the lyrics yourself. This is your chance to
This is
speak
my
out about that,
contribution to Rashomon.
Yeah, okay.
It is really Rashomon, first of all, because we are four, and we happen to be this Japanese quartet, that all of whom seem to recall it slightly differently. And that's as it should be, because we are very subjective people in our objective ways, and here we are trying to be objective for your sake. But I think in order to be so, we have to be somewhat subjective and Rashomonic, because that's the only way we can tell our truths to you as a group. As I recall, the origins were indeed in 49. Jerry called up and gave me this idea, and called Arthur at the same time and said, would you come over and let me explain it to you? As I remember it, Arthur and I were indeed quite excited about it. This is the first contradiction of the evening.
I don't contradict that.
We were yes, there are some details we go into, but I remember that evening very well. I remember it like yesterday, the evening at Jerry's apartment, because of the excitement. What was different, among many other things, but basically different from what turned out to be this show, was that it was conceived on the east side of New York and was a kind of East Side Story version of Romeo and Juliet, involving as the feuding parties Catholics and Jews, and the time was the coincidence of the Passover Easter season, in which feelings in the streets ran very high, and there was a lot of slugging and some bloodletting, which seemed to match the Romeo story very well, except that this was not family feuds, but religious or ethnic-oriented feuds. As a matter of fact, Arthur and I were so excited about it that we began to talk about it, and Arthur wrote a couple of sketched out scenes, one of which was a pretty complete first scene, actually. I was conducting a lot.
I remember absolutely none of this.
And I know. So I'll tell you exactly where I was. I was conducting a lot. I was traveling, and I was in St. Louis, Missouri, conducting that orchestra when I received a letter from you in St. Louis with the opening scene and an outline of a second one. And I remember it very well. I was excited, and when I got back to New York, we talked. You don't remember having done this?
No, because my reaction.
This is back in '49.
My reaction was that it was A.B.'s Irish Rose to music.
That's what was mine too.
Yes, and that's why we didn't go ahead.
Well,
then, as Jerry said, we were involved in James M. Cain's Serenade, and we brought it to Jerry, who said he wasn't interested, and started. I think you had come to us a couple of times the intervening years, and then what you did very effectively was knock out Serenade and start us thinking. And then by some lush coincidence, Lenny and I were at the Beverly Hills pool. And I remember you said...
For different reasons.
Very.
But at the same time. This
remember,
was 54, because I was
don't know. I have no idea of the year, but I remember you said, what about doing it about the Chicanos? And I said, why? In New York we have the Puerto Ricans, and at that time the papers were full of juvenile delinquents and gangs, and then we really got excited, and we called Jerry, and I think then the whole thing flew.
Actually, Arthur, we were sitting by the pool talking about other things, and there was a copy of the Los Angeles Times in the
pool,
in the deck chair next to us, an abandoned copy, the headline of which said, gang riots in Olivera Street. And this was about Mexicans and so-called Americans rioting together. And we both got interested in that because we had just been saying regretfully to each other, what a shame that never worked, and we never really did that show, and we still both had some ganas about it. The thing that worries me is that all this is really an answer to a question about Steve and how he got into it. And that's what I'm trying to get to, except that it takes a little doing. Yes, you are right. When we began, I had madly undertaken to do the lyrics as well as the music. And there was a certain point this is now 55, I guess, at which, for two reasons. For one, I was also working on another show called Candide, and for another, this musical, West Side Story, turned out to be extraordinarily balletic, which I'm very happy about, and turned out to need a tremendously more amount of music than I had expected, and ballet music, and symphonic music, and developmental music. And I realized for those two reasons, there are probably more, but those are enough for the moment, that I couldn't do the lyrics and all that music and do them well. And Arthur, when I was ruminating about this one day, said, you know, last week I was at a party and I heard a young fellow called Steve Sondheim sing some of his songs at this party, and
I must correct that on behalf of Steve.
I'll tell her.
Not at a party.
he wasn't young.
Not
All
at a party.
Wasn't at a party. He wasn't young.
He doesn't do
wasn't-
that at parties.
But he was singing a show he had written called Saturday Night. Is that true? Right. And well,
It's a small correction. What happened was that
you see what really happened.
when Serenade, Arthur was still connected with Serenade after Lenny and Jerry had dropped out, and he was auditioning people to write the songs. That's how he heard my songs. I played Saturday Night as an audition piece. And then, this is the confusion, I ran into Arthur many months later at a party.
At the
opening night
opening
party.
of Isle of Goats.
That's correct. Ugo Betty play. With Uda
By
Hagen.
Hogan.
Ugo Betty, Uda Hagen, it's an very unbeatable combination.
Uda Hagen is
Uda Hagen, Ugo
Hogan.
Betty. Anyway, and so I asked Arthur what he was doing, and he said he was beginning work on this musical, and in chatting, I said, you know, who's doing the lyrics? And he said, gee, we don't have anybody, because Comden and Green are supposed to, but they are in California, and they may be tied up with a movie contract, and we have to begin work on it within the week. Would you like to come and play for Leonard Bernstein? And I said, sure. And next day, I met Lenny, and that's why you thought it was at a party, because we had run into each other at a party, but he'd heard it as an audition piece.
You left out the smiter.
I did. Well, yes. Arthur literally smote his forehead when he said, "Gee, I never thought of you." And he went like that. And I looked at his forehead, and he has a small depression there. And I thought, that's really a man struck by an idea.
Well, I freaked out when Steve came and sang his songs for me. And from that moment to this, we've been loving colleagues and friends.
The week later, the picture kept Betty and Adolph in California, so I was lucky and I got the job.
Lenny, are any of the lyrics in West Side Story your creation as the show now stands?
How do you remember that, Steve?
2 lines.
2 lines.
I remember 200. But that's fine.
One really, no, one, well, 2 specific lines. God knows we talked about lyrics a lot, but the original ending of G. Officer Krupke ended with, not the euphemism, but I guess I better not say it in these, ended with an Anglo-Saxon expletive.
Heilige Hau.
And Hal Prince and Bobby Griffith, and one of Roger Stevens' assistants, a lady named Sylvia Drewley, came in to hear it, and she turned pale colors after she heard that phrase. And so Hal and Bobby drew us aside and said, listen, it really is a shocker. I mean, we know what you're getting out of it. Nobody had ever said a word like that in a musical on stage, and I think only a couple of seasons before, the first expletive that had ever been said on the New York stage was said by Burl Ives in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. So we thought, why not take a little liberty with our musical and make it the Cat on a Hot Tin Roof of the season. And she was so shocked, and Hal was genuinely upset. He said, whatever you guys want to write is fine, but she is, after all, a rather sophisticated listener, and you may be alienating most of your audience. And so I said, but what can we do? And Lenny came up with a line that now stands there, which is to use the man's name as a verb, which is a brilliant solution, because it's funny, and at the same time everybody knows what you're doing, and you don't need the expletive, which in a way would have been out of place anyway, since the rest of the script was written in a kind of patois that Arthur invented. It was not real street talk. That's something we can go into that's interesting, is that the problem with writing colloquialisms, and particularly slang and argot, is it dates so quickly And so Arthur, he knew that if he used any of the slang that was on the streets in 1955, by the time we got the show on, particularly by the time we got this show on, it would be 23 skidoo, and you'd say, where did all that go? And so he made up the patois. So Krupp U is a perfect example of the style of the script. And the other line that I particularly remember is the last line of Tonight Sleep Well, and when you dream, dream of me. I was struggling over that line, and I'd written maybe 40 alternates. And I showed them to him. He said, but why don't you take that one and join it to that one? In other words, I had numerous two-word phrases to begin with and numerous end phrases, and put it together, and of course made that line, which is lovely. Those are the two lines I particularly remember.
That's very generous of you, Steve.
I told you I was going to be generous today.
Well, Steve, the other part of the West Side Story lore while we're here that you can contribute to is that, did you write any of the music?
Just 2 lines.
2 lines. Now that the 4 of you are together working on the show, with this new kid in town, Steve, and the 3 of you, how did you begin? Where did you work? What number was written first? Was it Arthur's outline that?
I can remember what Lenny had written, Maria, and I think, and
with the title?
And the beginning of Cool, which had the
That's
title.
3 lines I wrote.
Cool. No, as a matter of fact, yes, come to think of it, you've written
I wrote a line
Crazy
called
Boy.
Maria.
Crazy Boy. No.
Did I write Crazy Boy?
Yeah. And the beginning of Cool, which you'd not finished, and Maria, which I think you'd completed as a tune, though not as a lyric. And those were the 2 things
Not as a
that I knew of.
satisfactory lyric.
All right. But those I remember. Were there more?
No, I wasn't going to go into the detail of that. I'd like to talk a little about that period, because I think it was one of the most exciting periods in the theater I've ever had. That period of the collaboration, where we were feeding each other all the time. It just came in, and we would meet at Lenny's house, we'd meet at my house, we'd meet wherever we could meet, dependent on our schedules. But Arthur would come in with the scene. Someone would say, I think I can do a song on this. I'd supply, hey, how about if we did this with the dance? What if we did this? What if we did that? And there was a wonderful sort of a mutual exchange going on of a very exciting way. I mean, we can talk about details. I did this, I supplied that, but the essence of it was that what we gave to each other, took from each other, yielded to each other, surrendered, reworked, put back together again. All those things, which was a very important and exciting time. And I think that's sort of, in a way, the collaboration was most fruitful during that digestive period. And I say that because we got turned down so much, and for so many reasons, that we kept going back to the script all the time, or back not to the script, our play, and saying, well, if that didn't work, I wonder why not. What didn't they like? Let's take a look at it again. I remember Richard Rogers' contribution was that we had a death scene for Maria, as I remember, a plot that she was going to commit suicide or something. And he said, she's dead already when this all happens to her. I mean, I remember him saying that, and giving it up, so that the walls that we hit, in a way, were helpful to us and made us always go back. I'm particularly glad that we didn't get it on right away, because I think that time in between when we tried to and we finally did was a time of immense amount of work.
May I say amen to that and give 2 specific examples of what Jerry's talking about that just flashed? I mean, collaboratively speaking, I must say that for me it was one of the most extraordinary collaborations of my life, perhaps the most. In that sense, in that very sense of our nourishing one another and feeding with a generosity on everybody's part that I've rarely seen in the theater. One example is a song that wound up called Something's Coming, which wasn't there at all until I think we were in rehearsal already. It was a very late comer. We realized we needed an introductory character kind of song for Tony, the lead, and there was a marvelous introductory page of a script for him that Arthur had written, which was a kind of monologue, although he wasn't alone on stage, which the essence of which became the lyric for this song. We raped Arthur's playwriting, Arthur's script, and I've never seen anybody so not just willing, but generous and encouraging. Take it, yes, set it to music, make it his song. Almost all those lyrics were written as prose, poetic prose, had been written by Arthur earlier.
Arthur, you remember it that way? Because I remember it as a scene that ended with the line, "Something's coming," 3 dots.
Yeah,
and I thought it would make a wonderful title.
Every morning I get up and reach out, and all that, which is still there. It's still there.
But I think the main thing is really
down the block.
I think the main thing is what Jerry said, which is true and extraordinary. I mean, if I push myself, I can think of when 1 or 2 of us were isolated. But in my memory, it's the 4 of us together almost all the time, and that verb Jerry used about feeding. It really is true, and I think it was without any consciousness. We were just all high on the work and loving it. And
you might be interested to know, excuse me, Arthur, that this is one of the shortest books in any major musical on Broadway, and this is a testimony to Arthur's particular generosity in this matter. I mean, he didn't say, "I'm sorry, that's mine, that's got to be said. My scene, what's going to happen to my scene with my characters, I have to develop." None of that. He gave everything he could to...
that's very sweet. There's one place I was too generous.
Oh.
No, I tell you what it is. You know, we all have set speeches that we make about various things, various beliefs we have. And I've always said I believe the climax of a musical, and all through it should be musicalized. Well, the climax of West Side Story is not musicalized. It's a speech. It's what I wrote as a dummy lyric for an aria for Maria. Some rather, to me, flossy words about guns and bullets, and it was supposed to be set to music, and it never was.
Yes, it was,
And
and,
it's still-
discarded
Oh,
4 or
wow.
5 times. It's not that I didn't try.
Why don't you
Arthur.
try once more?
I tried every way.
I think what's interesting is that, you know, once we just all 4 were talking about the creative processes, that was the exciting time, and that's what the show came out of. And this is a lesson for all you future collaborators to think about. At that time, it's a state of creative bliss with work, hard work. Later on, years later, you're going to start to pull it apart. And our paths have all gone different ways. You know, Arthur can say, well, I did this, and Lenny can say, and I can say, and Steve can say, and we're sort of going off in different directions. But at the time, we weren't thinking about where we are now, or that the show would be what it was. I think we're all dedicated to making that show happen, with pushes and pulls by everybody to get to where it was. I think Arthur had the hardest job of everybody, because if you take a Shakespeare play and you're going to convert it to today, music is nonverbal, dancing is nonverbal, and Steve also. And we had nothing to put our work against, while Arthur had that text and Mr. Williams S. there all the time, and the poetry of that. We could make our poetry out of the dancing, out of the music, out of the lyrics to the music. Arthur had really the hellish job and the burden to make his text go along and still communicate some of the poetry, some of the argot, and some of the drives and passions of the time, and trying to match somehow with the style that we were creating as we went along. I think that was, he had the toughest of all of us to try to get down that path.
There's another aspect of that, just for playwrights. One of the remarkable things about the book is not only that it's so brief, but how much happens in it. It is, after all, a melodrama. Most people think of Romeo and Juliet as a romance, but it's a melodrama. And in every scene, if there isn't a murder or a gang war, something extraordinary happens, something that has to be set up in terms of the plot and then has to pay off. So on top of the flavor of the piece, what is remarkable, I think, is the compactness of the plotting. That's one of the things that drives this show, even when it is not well sung or well danced or well set on the stage, is the plot is still exciting. It was when Shakespeare took it, and it was the way Arthur retold it. But to do it in as brief a span as this book does is what's remarkable.
It's extraordinary.
Well, last night I reread the script before this, and it's in an anthology, Great American Musicals, and it said page 54, West Side Story, page 74, and I said, no, that's a mistake. It can't be in 20 pages, and it's so much shorter than any other text, and there's about 8 musicals in that anthology.
Extraordinary.
Arthur, when you read it, the leanness of it is very impressive, but also so much of the show is accomplished in the dance sequences. So I assume you worked... The three of you worked in a very close way.
I was about to give an example. The other example that had flashed actually was the prologue, which, believe it or not, originally had words. And a lot of that extraordinarily instrumental music was sung. It didn't take us long to find out that that wouldn't work because you couldn't understand a syllable.
It took us 1 month.
Well,
that's how long we took to write it.
But you must tell them the subject of those.
That is when Jerry took over and converted all that stuff to this remarkable thing which is now known as the prologue to West Side Story, which is all done in movement. And that's the kind of thing I think Jerry meant in the beginning. That we all learn so from one another, and we learn how to relearn and to teach and to... It's an extraordinary exchange.
I remember Jerry
I
asking
like
a
it.
question before he started to work on that prologue, and it's the most important question you can ask at any time about anything in the theater. He said, "What is it about?" And so then we had to talk about what it was about, because one of the reasons that he is the most brilliant of all the choreographers we have is that he knows, not only knows, he knows how to do it, is that it has to be about something, a musical theater. You just cannot get up and do an abstract dance. And when it's about something, then no one knows better how to make them dance and move the story.
Lenny, when you decided that you could do this prologue without the words, did you write new music then?
I extended the music somewhat.
Was this an easy show to write, a fast show?
Oh, Lord.
With slow producing, or was it the actual writing of it?
Well, it took us, from the time I came aboard, when Arthur already had this sort of outline, which did change a lot, an hour and a half, a year and a half. A year and a half, because for 6 months in there, everybody went off and did something else, which may have also helped
You
us
once
get some
counted for me
perspective.
13 months. You counted up actual working months, and they came to 13.
In the middle of it, Candide came alive again. It had been sort of
Shelved.
moribund or shelved, and then it had a new life. And so Lenny did that, and Jerry did, I think, Bells Are Ringing during this period. And then Arthur did Clearing in the Woods, and I worked for television. And it was a 6-month hiatus, and when we came back, I think it probably helped us get a perspective. I don't remember any particular perspective we got, but it's nice to get away from something and come back. You can view it fairly coldly.
Were most of the changes in West Side made in the writing process or in rehearsal? The big changes?
I'd like to answer that, if I may, because I have an anecdote, which is that I think this show probably changed less. It certainly changed less in any show I've ever done from the first, let's say, first preview in Washington to the opening in New York, with the exception of Sweeney Todd, which also had almost no changes in it. And we fiddled with the opening number in Washington, and with, I think Lenny and Jerry fiddled with the second act, the Dream Ballet. And
We also fiddled with a couple of extra numbers which never...
which never got in, but we've been writing those in New York, and it never got in. But on the way to the airport, leaving Washington, I said, after, we'd had a very nice run down there, I said, I thought, ingenuously, but I'm afraid in retrospect arrogantly, to Jerry. I said, gee, it's my first show, and I just miss all those. I wanted to sit up till 3 o'clock in the morning in smoke-filled rooms and rewrite the second act. And he looked at me with a look of such anger, and he said, in effect, he said, just take that back. Don't ever say that out loud. Until you've been through it, you don't know how I thought it was all glamorous. After that, I had some 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock hotel room scenes in subsequent years, and I realized Jerry was right. But the show got changed very little. It was what it was when it opened.
The same numbers that were in Washington that opened in New York. No songs.
Almost identical.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We had 7 weeks rehearsal.
8.
8?
That's unusual, is certainly 8.
It was the first time it ever been
That's
done.
It was the first time.
What was it? Why was that? Because of the amount of dance?
Well, because there was a large amount of dance, and there was a hell of a book to put on, and there were a lot of numbers to stage, and I was going to do all of it. And I got permission, it was the first time I got permission from Equity to rehearse 4 weeks prior to the rest of the rehearsal period for us to be able to do all of it. It also was an exceptional cast.
They got no money.
Really was a wonderful cast, and somehow or other I was able to pull them into the reality of that show and the belief in the show and the dedication to it. And as far as collaboration is concerned, also prior to that, as all collaborators have to do, we had to sort out, is this guy going to sing, or is he going to dance, or is he just going to act, and which of those abilities can we use most, and then if he only does these, how can we put it together with the rest of the show? And we were very fortunate in getting the cast that we did, because all of them could be from a great dancer like Cheetah to someone like Larry, who had a wonderful voice and could move, could do acrobatic things when we needed it. And we were very fortunate with that cast altogether.
It's the hardest show to cast I still have ever heard of, because everybody has to seem to be a teenager, actually either be or seem to be, and be able to sing a very difficult score, act a very difficult book, and dance very difficult dances. And everybody has to seem to be doing all of it, so that Larry Kurt and Carl Laurents, not being basically dancers but singers, right, had to seem to be dancing as much as anybody else. And what part of Jerry's magic was to make it seem that way. We were also very lucky in finding people like Mickey Callan to play Riff, who sang cool, not like an operatic star, but the way it should have been sung. I thought it was just wonderful, and he was a fabulous dancer, and I thought a fine and more than creditable actor.
The casting went on over a period of 6 months, as I recall it. The 4 months lasted. Cheryl Crawford was the producer who had the property along with Roger Stevens longer than anybody else, quite a long time, and she dropped it just 2 months before we were going to rehearsal. I want to tell that anecdote about the Algonquin Hotel, if I can. Which was the day she dropped it, we went to drown our sorrows because it was 2 months
Shucks,
away.
I wanted to tell that.
All right.
I'll tell my version later.
All right. But during those 4 months, we were auditioning in her office and actors, and then when Hal and Bobby took it over, in the remaining 2 months, we had many more auditions, and 6 months of auditions was needed, but it's a very unusual time.
If I can detour back about the book, Arthur, I think it was Steve, you mentioned some of the language Arthur's created. When I reread it, I was very aware of certain words that almost are nonsense, but they make great sense if you read them in rhythm and as straight chalk. And when did you make this decision to create a whole vocabulary?
Right at the beginning.
Very beginning, you knew.
And when they get around to telling the Cheryl Crawford story, I remember one of the things she was on my back about. She said she didn't like the book. And she said, no place do they say that's how the cookie crumbles.
She wanted that in
very badly. I think maybe if I'd put it in, she might have produced it.
It might be interesting for the playwrights here to know that the ostensible reason, I have every reason to believe she was telling the truth, but certainly what she said to us, that she was dropping it was that she wanted us to explain more why these kids were the way they were. And the more we tried to explain to her that this was not a sociological treatise, but a fantasy, if you will, a fantasia, a poetic interpretation of a social situation, the less she understood what we were saying, and she wanted it to be more realistically grounded. Now, that may have been masking some other fears she had, but that's what she told us. And if we'd ever gone that way, I think we would have killed the piece.
It sounds like an
Do
inspiration.
you want to
for
hear a
Officer
real Rashomon contradiction?
Yeah, go.
I remember Cheryl saying to us, and maybe she said it to me and you had left the room to get a drink of water, but she said, we have had this whole school of Ashcan realism. Now, I kind of made that up.
That's not necessarily a contradiction.
That's not a contradiction. I
But
have a
she-
letter.
you
I have
said
a
she
letter
wanted
that
it
she
to be
wrote.
more realistic.
She,
No, I didn't say
Lenny,
that.
I have a letter that she wrote in which she said she wanted it to see how the neighborhood changed from immigrant Jews to Puerto Ricans and blacks.
Goodness.
That would have been-
Well,
That's a letter I've never seen.
my version of Cheryl's withdrawal is very simple. She couldn't raise the money. And I don't think that was very. I think
and she
it's.
behaved immorally because she didn't say that.
No, but it was not. It's hard now in our present day with the present musicals that we have to understand how radical this show looked on paper, how distressing it was to people.
Well,
They
Jerry,
wouldn't touch it.
This might be a good place to remind everyone that the Tony Award that year went to The Music Man,
Yeah.
and it's hard to believe now.
There was also a letter in the Herald Tribune a few months later from Meredith Willson, who wrote The Music Man, complaining about how musicals should not deal with ugly subjects.
And some of the critics were a little appalled, but
Were appalled.
but respectful. I mean, in rereading the reviews, they're much better than rumor has it now. You know, West Side, got mixed reviews.
Well, the
Greek
idea
lawyers
of a
giving-
musical, in the first act of which ends with two corpses on the stage as the curtain comes down, was really reprehensible to many people at that time.
And also-
And even the score itself, I remember Steve and I, poor bastards that we were, trying by ourselves at a piano to audition this score, mind you, for Columbia Records, which was my record company. And they said no. They said there's nothing in it anybody can sing. It's too depressing. It's too advanced. It's too crazy. There are too many tritones. There are too many words in the lyrics. Nobody can remember them. The intervals, it's too rangy. Who can sing Maria? Nobody can sing notes like that. I just read impossible. And they turned it down. They later changed their minds, but that moment, that afternoon, Steve, I'm sure, will not forget. I don't think there's any Rashomon about this, because we both slaved and tried to sing sextets and quintets and chorus parts and tried to play fugues and cool fugues on the piano, and he would help out. It's because, thank God, he was a musician and he could play the piano. And we could do some of it four hands, and it didn't work. Gur nicht helfen. There was a tremendous animosity to the whole idea, as you can see, both musically and bookically and every other way.
I think that people are not here that helped make that show, which were the scene designer, the costume designer, and the lighting designer.
Amen.
Because they fed in and also supported us, interpreted for us, enhanced what we were doing. I think that first act finale scene of Act One, that Rumble set, is one of the most beautiful sets, and made the atmosphere for it to happen before we even started to.
I think I can still see that
Yeah.
set very vividly.
And
you see the set coming
and the
in,
change
the
of
thing
going
one
into
can
the
never
gym,
forget.
coming
And the
out of
change
the
to the gym, I don't think anyone's ever
As a matter
forgotten
of fact,
that.
I remember when Oliver first brought his designs, he said, and I became the old-fashioned person. I said, well, where's your closing in one so we can work in one while you're changing the sets behind? He said, well, we're not going to do that. And that was like, wait a minute, what's happening? This is going to be a whole new game here. And he had part of the set was going up and down stage, and I said, well, where are you going to show the lights from? How are we going to get in and out? All these things which he solved for us and enhanced us with. And the same with Irene Schaaf's costume, and particularly at the time, Gene Rosenthal's lighting.
I'd like to tell something about the sets. When we got down to Washington, there had been a mistake Oliver had not gotten the right dimensions for the stage, so that when the bedroom set was supposed to roll off in the second act to make room for the Dream Ballet, which required a totally clear and empty stage, it rolled off, and about a third of it didn't roll off because the wing space at the National Theater was tiny. And being my first show, I immediately had a hysterical fit, said, well, we can't open, or something like that. And Jerry said, we have 1,500 people coming Monday night, and so we'll just take a saw and we'll saw it in half. And and he was more upset than anybody because, after all, it was the moment of the ballet. I mean, he was building the entire scene and song to this, or scene and music to this moment, and it just didn't work at all because it was half of a bedroom or a third of a bedroom on stage. And I thought he would blow his top. Not at all. Totally cool. He just got a saw, or got Ruth Mitchell to get a saw, and they sawed the set in half, and for the opening night in Washington, half the bedroom went off that way, and half the bedroom went off that way. And that's how to direct a show.
It's a beautiful story. A little bit Rashomon on that one.
All right.
Okay, the set was supposed to go off, except Oliver designed it not to go off. He designed it so there would be these arches on either side, which were the remains of the bedroom set. You're right. And I really was pretty furious inside, and I just went forward to Oliver and said, that set has to go off, and you solve it. I didn't get a saw out. I just said to him, you solve it, that has to go off. And he did. No saw in hand for me. Okay.
I like the Saw version, but
I do too, but it's not true.
yours is too aggressive.
For all of you, was Romeo and Juliet always the source for this show that you kept going back to, parallels and either following
It was
them or
Jerry's
diverging?
source, and Jerry was our source. So that's how it
I
happened.
tell you what's remarkable.
I'd like to tell something about the sets. When we got down to Washington, there had been a mistake made. Oliver had not gotten the right dimensions for the stage, so that when the bedroom set was supposed to roll off in the second act to make room for the Dream Ballet, which required a totally clear and empty stage, it rolled off, and about a third of it didn't roll off because the wing space at the National Theater was tiny. And being my first show, I immediately had a hysterical fit, said, well, we can't open, or something like that. And Jerry said, we have 1,500 people coming Monday night, and so we'll just take a saw and we'll saw it in half. And and he was more upset than anybody because, after all, it was the moment of the ballet. I mean, he was building the entire scene and song to this, or scene and music to this moment, and it just didn't work at all because it was half of a bedroom or a third of a bedroom on stage. And I thought he would blow his top. Not at all. Totally cool. He just got a saw, or got Ruth Mitchell to get a saw, and they sawed the set in half, and for the opening night in Washington, half the bedroom went off that way, and half the bedroom went off that way. And that's how to direct a show.
It's a beautiful story.
A little bit Rashomon on that one.
All right.
Okay, the set was supposed to go off, except Oliver designed it not to go off. He designed it so there would be these arches on either side, which were the remains of the bedroom set. You're right. And I really was pretty furious inside, and I just went forward to Oliver and said, that set has to go off, and you solve it. I didn't get a saw out. I just said to him, you solve it, that has to go off. And he did. No saw in hand for me. Okay.
I like the Saw version, but
I do too, but it's not true.
yours is too aggressive.
For all of you, was Romeo and Juliet always the source for this show that you kept going back to, parallels and either following
It was
them or
Jerry's
diverging?
source, and Jerry was our source. So that's how it
I
happened.
tell you what's remarkable about Arthur's book, too, is that one doesn't realize how he managed to follow that story, and sometimes scenes, as outlined in the Shakespeare play, without the audience realizing it or critics realizing it. I thought that was a real achievement, that there are these scenes which follow each other in a certain way, and a long arc of a pattern, which is in the Shakespearean play. And everyone gets so caught in our story that they don't refer it back to the similarities between it.
Wonderful dovetailing of incidents. And there was an addition, Arthur, remember, with the Shakespeare play following your book.
Yes.
Remember that? I think it's out of print now, but it was
The hardest part,
a marvelous lesson to read
the
them
objective
together.
correlative that was hardest to achieve, Arthur, correct me if it was not, but I remember it being, is how to find a contemporary, a realistic, a naturalistic, a believable substitute for the whole filter, the potion part of the Shakespearean plot, because how can somebody take poison, seem to be dead, and then become alive again? And that's what led us to the fake suicide that we were talking about earlier, which was going to be a sort of mad aria that Maria had. And then eventually Arthur solved it by the false news that Anita brings when she's raped. But wasn't that the hardest thing to
actually
find
the
out?
thing I'm proudest of in the telling of the story is why she can't get the message through, which is prejudice, which is right in with the theme of the piece. And I think that's better than whoever wrote the story originally in Italy, whenever it was.
It's funny that it's the point of the Shakespeare plot, if we can call it a Shakespeare plot, where we spent most of the time and had most of the sludge and had to
Because
fight. And you
it's
were fighting
melodrama.
for Shakespeare. You, strangely enough, you were the most faithful. And we finally said, but why do we have to stick to it at this point? And then you found the solution. And that's another incidence of this interfeeding. I think while we're toasting absent friends and colleagues, mention really should be made of Roger Stevens, because he saved us at, I think, the most critical moment, which was the moment just after Cheryl Crawford said to the four of us in the Algonquin Hotel,
Oh, in her office?
in her office, I'm sorry, it was
Nearby.
near the Algonquin Hotel. You have to rewrite this whole thing, or I don't do it.
Shorter,
And
anyway.
we all stood up and said, well, goodbye, and left very bravely, all trusting in one another's fortitude, and walked to the corner and stood in Times Square, the corner of whatever 40-something street that is, and all went to jelly suddenly and said, what have we done? We have no producer. What do we do now? And Arthur went into a phone booth and called London Collect from a public phone booth, called Roger Stevens, who was in London and had left his number and said, if you're in trouble, this is where I'll be. And we were, God knows, in trouble. He called him, he came out of that phone booth saying, Roger says, whatever happens, keep working, just keep writing it. I will guarantee everything somehow. Just don't worry about it. This was the lifesaver. This was the crucial quarter. And I can never praise that man enough for that one moment when he gave us the strength to have the courage of our own somewhat shaken convictions.
I have two addenda I'd like to add to that. One is that before we got to the phone booth, the Algonquin Hotel played a part because we went in to have a drink and decide what to do, and they wouldn't let us in because Arthur didn't have a tie on.
That's why I have it
It's
on
called
today. I knew he was going to tell it.
I thought, insult to injury. I mean, our entire lives had gone down the drain, and they wouldn't let us have a drink. So we went next door to a place I'm sure all of you know called the Iroquois. Algonquin's next to the Iroquois, which was a bar, and Arthur did indeed get into a phone booth, and my memory is that you called Germany. Was it Germany or London?
London.
It was London. And the other thing was that I got on the phone that night and talked to Hal Prince and Bobby Griffith, Hal in Boston, who was trying out New Girl in Town. And he said, you sound terrible. And I said, well, we just lost our show today. And he said, well, why don't you send it to Bobby and me? And I said, because 2 years ago, you said it really wasn't for you. And he said, well, I know you've done work on it, and I'm, anxious to get on to the next show after this one opens. And I had trouble actually getting a complete script because we were still futzing with stuff, but I got up there, and within 24 hours they called and said they would do it. And it was all very well and good to have Roger be the kind of the post and the centerpiece, but Roger had a number of interests, could not have taken the next 2 months solely on us. And we had to get the show into rehearsal by a certain date because Lenny was about to take over the Philharmonic, and I believe your first concert was in Israel, and you had to be in Israel in September, right? And so we had to get the show into rehearsal by a certain date so that we could get open by a certain date before he had to leave. And in fact, I think you left October 1st, we opened September 27th. We just made it with 4 days to spare. But those of you who've been through this mill, you know how hard it is to get a producer within 2 months to accept it, raise the money, finish the casting, and go ahead and book theaters and all that, particularly a show as unusual and peculiar as this. And it turned out that Roger and Hal and Bobby made a wonderful combination for us.
Does anyone remember what the show cost now?
375? 350? 350?
That was a lot then, and mostly caused by the long rehearsal period.
I remember Bobby and Hal saying, the costumes are too expensive, and Jerry said, they said, Sheriff's too expensive. And Jerry said, how much is in your budget? And they said, $65,000. He said, she'll do it, and she did.
Yeah.
One of the things that Hal was wonderful at,
What an
Hal Bobby
incredible
was-
woman, huh?
but the whole thing of making us all, but when Hal and Bobby came in on it, we all felt that we had to make quick decisions, that we could do whatever was required of us. And I think it was, what happened was that the wheels got greased. It got very exciting. We felt that because with Cheryl, with all our enthusiasm and all that, there was this feeling of a kind of, are we going to get into rehearsal on time and all that? But suddenly when there was this actual deadline, it was right around the corner and we knew it was 8 weeks away, everything got solved.
What are your impressions of the rehearsal period itself, those 8 weeks? Good.
I'm sorry.
What were the 8 weeks rehearsals? How do they seem in retrospect?
How did it
to you?
feel?
Yeah.
Oh, it was wonderful. And remember, we started in a place called the Chester Hale Studio, which is now gone. It was on 56th Street, near Carnegie Hall, and it was, what now you would call a loft above a garage. And I don't think I'd be able to work in it now. I need more space. But in those days we did, and we had about 4 weeks then. I think we already started into some of the book, but not too much, and some of the staging of the numbers. Also, by the way, I had, we should mention him, is the assistants and co-choreography of Pete Gennaro, who did for the show most of America Dance, and did the Sharks dances in the competition in the dance hall. And also he was very supportive all the way through. And we, I don't know, I just remember always being in a state of, oh, it's moving, something's happening, we're going on, not getting stuck. I don't remember getting stuck anywhere. We played around, I know, a lot at the, what's the scene? The marriage scene. The bridal shop. Took us a lot of work to try to get that going right, with a lot of cuts and a lot of musical that you wrote for it, and so
We made one big change in rehearsal. That was important.
Tonight.
Yeah, one hand was not, that was the fire escape scene, the balcony scene, and it was moved. And then Lenny and Steve wrote Tonight.
Things change. I mean,
Tonight was written during rehearsal, in other
Yeah.
words.
Tonight originally was in a different place. It
And,
was
and
supposed
one
to.
hand was the
And then
night
we,
first meeting.
we just said, come on, what if we try it here? Which was wonderful about rehearsal. I mean, you have the chance to try something, so we moved it to the spot it's in now, and that seemed to be very exciting, even though in theory it wouldn't be.
There was another example of that. The quintet was, exactly, was before the bridal
That's
shop.
what I'm talking about.
Yes, exactly. But then you said, we argued that it didn't make any logical sense to put it afterwards. And Jerry said, but it makes theatrical sense. And he was absolutely right. And he ran it both ways, I think, once during one of the run-throughs, or in 2 successive run-throughs, one before the bridal shop, one afterwards. And in spite of the fact that the 3 of us felt that logically it belonged before, it turned out that we were wrong. That Jerry's instinct was absolutely right.
Lenny, were you composing the dance music to go along with, were you working with Jerry, or had you composed it in advance?
We worked very much together.
Together.
It means in rehearsal. You don't mean at rehearsal.
Once rehearsal
Yeah,
started,
had
of
you
course,
written-
we couldn't be together every minute.
But you'd written a lot of the dance music in
we
before you
had-
went into rehearsal,
we
is
had
what I'm
written
asking.
an awful lot, really together. I mean,
Before rehearsal.
I remember all my collaborations with Jerry in terms of one tactile bodily feeling, which is his hands on my shoulders, composing with his hands on my shoulders. This may be metaphorical, but it's the way I remember it. I can feel him standing behind me saying, yeah, now just about like 4 more beats there, and another bar. No, that's too much. There's too many. There, that's it.
Well, also it goes the other way, because Lenny would play something and I'd take off right there in the room he was composing in. I say, oh, I can see this kind of movement or that kind of movement. And
Did I ever give you a step?
Oh, you always give me a step.
This is unusual, isn't it, Jerry?
I think, for instance, like for the second act ballet, I wrote a scenario for it, so that he had that as a premise to start with, and then he would compose on that, and then we'd get together, he'd play me, and I'd say, oh, that sounds wonderful, or I like this, let's have more of that, or I can't extend it that long. It's the kind of collaboration which happens in the theater.
There was only one moment when I was really scared to play you something. That was the Cool Fugue. The Fugue of Cool, which is 12-tone music. And I thought, oh, Jerry is going to hate this so much, and he's going to say it's out of style. And it was the thing he reacted to, I think, most of anything in the show. He freaked out. And I was so happy, because I'd been so worried.
Steve, I want to ask you a question about the lyrics. You're very fond now of turning on some of them. Why didn't you change?
I was fond then
Did you
of
like them
turning on
then?
some of them.
Oh, even then. Why didn't you then?
I was outvoted. I remember I changed the lyric of "I feel pretty" after seeing the run-through in New York in front of the audience. I was just so ashamed of it. I changed it, I simplified it, and everybody, Arthur, Jerry, and Lenny all said, no, it was better the way it was before, so I went home. I'm not fond of a lot of the lyrics. They're very written. They're very written to me. I like things like Something's Coming and the Jet Song because they have a kind of energy to them. The more contemplative lyrics I find very self-conscious, and I think made the show a mite pretentious every now and then. I would hear a writer at work instead of the characters at work when they would sing those lyrics.
What about Officer Krupke?
Well, I like some of the jokes there. There's some not such good jokes there, and that, incidentally, parenthetically, Jerry staged, I believe, in 3 hours by the clock. We kept urging him we said, there's this comedy number, aren't you going to get to it? It was about 3 days before we were going to Washington. I exaggerate, but I mean, it was the last week of rehearsals, and Jerry had been staging everything else, and it's a huge amount of stuff to stage there. And he said, I'll get to it. It's like when you ask a director, when are we going to do the curtain calls? I'll get to it. You do it in a couple minutes. Well, he said, all right, I'll do it. And one afternoon, he did it, I believe, between 2 and 5 o'clock. I may be exaggerating, but it took almost no time. Now, maybe the idea of the cooking a lot, but the staging of that number, for those of you who saw it, is one of the most, I won't say intricate, but brilliantly inventive in-one numbers I've ever seen in my life. Just the staging alone could make you laugh, and also the energy of that staging.
Well, I think a lot of that is due that at the point that I went into it, which was near the end of the rehearsal period, and by that time you're really into the work. You know your actors, you know the scenes, and you're already so into it. It isn't like the first days where you're fishing around and going a little tentatively toward what you want. You're on course. It's like those numbers that you write while you're in rehearsal, or the ones that you write out of town. By that time, the wheels are rolling, so you are so into the character of the show, the food of the show, the energy of the show.
Also, that number had to be cast. It was like a little
Right.
show in itself,
Right.
and by then you knew each kid so well.
And also, I find myself that I do a lot of my best work when I'm tired and have less tension inside of me, and more, I can devote it more to devote my energy straight to the work.
Well, one of my objections to Krupke was always that I felt that it was out of place in the second act, that where it should occur is in the first act, and the cool should occur where Krupke was, because here are a group of kids who are running from a double murder, and for them to stop and do this comic number about social situations seemed to me to be out of place. And I kept nudging and bugging Jerry and Arthur and Lenny, couldn't we please reverse the two, and we didn't. And of course, Krupke works wonderfully in the second act on the old drunken porter principle, the Shakespearean principle. In the middle of a melodrama, you cut it, with... On the other hand, when Shakespeare does it, it's an irrelevant character. For the movie, they were reversed, and they weren't nearly as effective, in my opinion. And again, there was a theatrical truth about putting Krupke there that was not a lyric truth or a logical truth.
It's a release of
that
energy. It's
originally
not just comic relief, it's comic release.
Yes.
Originally, I was the only one for it, and I sold it to you on the very grandiose business about the porter scene
That's
in
it.
Shakespeare.
Which never makes anyone laugh when you see Macbeth.
No, but it releases the tension.
But the porter's name wasn't Krupke.
How were the reviews in Washington? Did you feel you
Splendid.
had this? You felt you had a
The
hit
only
there?
thing I remember about Washington was the first preview, and I was sitting in front of Jerry. We didn't have a clue. We all loved the show. I personally thought it was going to run 3 months, maybe. And the show started, and at some point, you just felt it in the theater, and Jerry began to pound me on the back and said, they like it, they like it. That's the only thing I remember about it.
It's the only time Something's Coming ever stopped the show. It was that night. There was something, as we say in the air. Something's Coming stopped the show. It never did again. We fiddled out of town. One of the things we did out of town was try to find another ending for Something's Coming because it never worked. I mean, it always worked, but it never got that kind of a hand again. And we kept thinking maybe it was the performer, and then it wasn't, and we kept writing high, loud endings and low, trail-off endings, and we could never make it get a hand, and we finally just gave up on it. But there was something about that night. Arthur's right about
It was an incredible night. The first instance I had, besides these little...
We're in Washington still, right?
The first night in Washington, yes. It was extraordinary. Because you have to understand, it was August in horrible Washington, in the old National Theater. There was no Kennedy Center, naturally. And none of us knew whether anybody would listen to it or look at it or stay in the theater, because we had had a lot of insults on this show and a lot of warnings, and you're crazy and give it up. And at intermission, there was an incredible feeling in the house, and I remember Justice Felix Frankfurter in a wheelchair coming up to me. What? I mean, the most distinguished man in Washington coming in a wheelchair in tears and saying that the history of America is now changed. And this was only intermission. I don't know what he thought at the end, but it was an incredible hello, because we didn't know whether it was even all right, to say nothing of that it was something special and particularly moving to people.
Right.
When Steve was talking about his not being happy with some of the lyrics now, I think probably we all look at that work now from this vantage point and think, if we see it, oh, I think maybe I could have done this or could have done that. I think the big point is that the show at its time was quite a radical change. Mm-hmm. Now, when it's performed, it doesn't look like it. So much of the techniques, qualities, subject matter, values of contribution seem to be a matter of course now in other shows. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I see it, I think, it looks a little old-fashioned to me.
Mm. But certainly the boldness of the show was very much appreciated by the original critics. I mean, they all said, hey, we've never seen the likes of this remotely. In fact, in rereading the reviews, the only thing that struck me was that they were much better than you sort of start believing these stories yourself, that they were mixed reviews. They're really very, very strong. But is the absence of mention of Steve's work is so shocking when you read them now, that Walter Kerr and Brooks Atkinson do not mention the word Stephen Sondheim. They talk about the score, the direction, the book, and I don't know who they thought.
Maybe they agree with me on the lyrics.
So, it's amazing now to think that
I don't think there's
your
anything
first
amazing
show
about
was
that,
so
Terrence.
what?
There's nothing amazing about that. Review is review reputations, not
Well,
books.
that's what I'm going to say. Steve was the newcomer with this show, and but it's quite amazing now to read Walter Kerr review that does not mention the enormous contribution of Stephen.
Well, I saw the most recent West End story I've seen was only a couple of months ago in London, and an extraordinary evening, I must say, with a terrific reaction. And all the reviews mention Steve in the first paragraph at this point. If that's any consolation. I don't know.
It's 19.
I mean, Arthur is the one that, for me, doesn't get mentioned enough.
Well, he certainly did in 1957.
He's the hero.
You all did. You've had plenty of opportunities to make any changes. You just have resisted them, obviously. With the revivals, now the recording that's just come out, did you do anything? Did you fiddle with the
Oh, a big fiddle. You know what the big fiddle? There are two big fiddles. One is that I conducted it, which I've never done in my life. It's the first time I ever conducted the show. And it hasn't come out yet. It's this week. I think it's coming out this week. And the other big fiddle is that they're all opera singers singing it, which is something I had always toyed with, but can't be done on stage, obviously. You can't have people with, but can't. As well as possible, all the different things they had to do. But there is an ideal way of hearing One Hand, One Heart, for example. which I have always kept in the back of my mind, and I thought that maybe someday I could hear that sung the way I've always wanted it to be sung, which is quite slow, and it demands voices that have real endurance and real control and quality of an operatic kind. And that is so on this record. So in some ways it's come true. I also have a hand-picked orchestra and a fabulous cast in general. So that's a new experience. That's fiddling, I suppose.
But the
if you want
keys,
to
the
call it
orchestration,
fiddling.
Lenny, are the same.
Everything is the
else
same. No orchestration changes of any sort.
Let me ask you about the orchestrations. Did you choose, who did it? It's Sid Raymond and Erwin
I was
Kostel.
assisted by this team.
Yeah.
They were a team at the time. Sid Raymond, who was a dear old friend of mine, and his colleague, Erwin Kostel, who actually executed the orchestration. They did more than assist. I mean, I would indicate orchestration. This is after they all went home at 2:30 in the morning. Then we'd have orchestration sessions until dawn, in which I would indicate to them note by note exactly what I wanted in shorthand, which is legible and not intelligible only to orchestrators, people in the trade, so to speak. And then they would come back a couple of days later with a score, and then I would go over that to see what was wrong, that had not been interpreted correctly, whatever, and we would have a post-orchestration session. At the same time having another orchestration session on the next number coming up. So they really executed it in a way without which I don't think I could have gotten the score finished, because it took an enormous amount of doing.
Now let's go to opening night in New York. Was that a repeat of Washington?
No.
Did you know it was going?
The first half hour was pretty dead. They had heard so much. The audience, I think, had heard that this was a work of art, capital W, capital A, and so they sat there on their hands, as we say, and very attentive, like children in church, and until America. And at that point, they realized it was a musical,
You could
and they were
laugh,
supposed
too.
to be having a good time. They weren't laughing for it. They were most attentive, most quiet, not rustling programs, not coughing, but not responding and not having not allowing themselves to have a good time. They were at a museum, and they were real quiet and real well behaved. And suddenly, when America burst loose, they realized, because they could connect with some kind of musical that they had seen before, that we were just doing a musical. And from then on, I think it went very well.
It went marvelously. The biggest thing I remember from opening night was the set change from the end of the quintet, which brought an extraordinary response. This ensemble number, the Jets are going to, you know the one. And at the end, the high C and everything, there was a prolonged applause. And the set changed during the applause, because it was so prolonged, into this remarkable rumble set of Oliver's that Jerry mentioned before your eyes. And I remember this moment in which the applause was just beginning to dip. You know how you can sense after Casta Diva, after 2 minutes and 10 seconds, 11 seconds, and this whole wave of applause just rose again and repeated itself, just doubled the length of the preceding applause for the arrival of this set. And for me, this was one of the most magical moments in the theater. That's when I had the sense of a hit, if that's what you
One of the reasons I mentioned is because every review talks about the ovation the show received on opening night. They describe it very physically, too, like it's a real visceral impact the show had on the audience, which you're certainly in the climate of criticism today. You're not used to reading this kind of real reporting about the impact on the audience. And the reviews are very exciting to read. You feel, gee, I wish I'd been there. Must have been quite a night. Before we open it up a little bit, are there any last thoughts you'd like to, that I haven't asked you, and we could go on forever about this show? And
when you're talking about reviving it, as it's been revived over the years, as a director, I found something very fascinating, which is that at the time we did this show, the cast understood the material very, very well and very deeply and very organically. Somehow it was like they were part of the times. The recent revival, I found that, I'll say it badly, and I don't mean any slurs on it, but I found that the cast somehow already had rather middle-class attitudes, and that it was hard for them to understand the street, the turf, the toughness of the times, the necessity to own something, the struggle on the street, and I felt that I could never get out of them a real understanding of the material from an acting point of view and from a dancing point of view, both.
You mean in a way you didn't have to with the original
That I'd
production?
never had to in the
Yeah.
beginning. That was right in there. And I think
Interesting.
it's a time which is past. You see, they knew what it was about and could react to it. And a lot of the dancers were themselves. I mean, they were from the High School of Performing Arts at the time, which was not what it is now. And they were kids. I remember looking at pictures, a stack of them this high, and looking at faces to get the people we want and interviewing them all, which you don't have the time to do now.
You know what's weird, Jerry, is that my impression in London, which is the last time I saw the show, was that it was very understanding of the turf idea. And maybe they came to it later, or maybe it's still...
No, they're having a social revolution there now. That's why.
That's right.
Well, of course they are.
That's the problem.
And it's also the dancing has
That's what I
changed.
say.
Social dancing has changed. So that what then was amazing to us, that we took things that were being danced on. It's like if you put breaking dancing into a show now. I mean, people all know it and can do it. Maybe 20 years or 30 years from now, those dancers of theater won't be able to do break dance. They won't understand what it's about or why we're doing it.
One of the things that helped that was that Jerry kept the Jets and the Sharks as groups separate during rehearsals, or urged them to keep separate, to have their meals together as gangs. I thought it was terribly pretentious, and of course it was perfect because without there being animosity or hostility, there was a sense of each gang having its own individuality, so that you had two giant personalities on stage. And the other thing is that I believe this is the first show that the chorus of which had individual characterizations. Up until that time, all musicals had choruses, with maybe exceptions like Agnes de Mille having one girl who fell down in Oklahoma, where one or two people would be characterized in a chorus. Well, no, that wasn't important. Joe McCracken made a reputation on that because there was it was a character in the middle of a chorus, which was very unusual in those days.
Listed that way on the program.
That's right, the girl who falls down. But in this one, truly, that's what it says. That's what it says, the girl who falls down. In this one, each of the gang members had a name and a personality, and they were cast that way. And it was an individuated chorus. Everybody takes that for granted now. In most shows, many shows, there are individuated choruses. But in those days, it was a startling notion.
It was not only cast that way. Again, here's the collaboration comes into it. Because once we picked the people we wanted, Arthur began to write a little for them and give them names too. And we would shift lines around and say, oh, well, this can come out of this person, this can come out of that person. So a lot of those characters were formed through the rehearsal period, and with Arthur being there, seeing what could happen, what could not happen.
And they did something very touching and very extraordinary at the first run-through with an audience. We didn't know, but the two sides, the Jets and the Sharks, they picked colors, and they all wore them themselves.
I'd like to add just one thing, if I may. We're talking about the scene changes before I'm going into the last scene. There was an accident that happened in Washington, or I happened to turn back as we were leaving the theater, as they were flying in the gym set. And the gym set on the corners had streamers. And by my turning my head at the fortunate moment as they were preparing it, I saw those streamers come down. And then I ran to Oliver and said, can we make a whole curtain of that? Which we did. And that was a transition which, without that accident happening and one catching it and Oliver being ready to collaborate on it, I don't think that going into the gym would have been half as good. I really don't, because that excitement of these things coming down and then lifting the curtain behind it, seeing through it, taking them up into the thing, all happened.
And Maria whirling, and the girls then whirling as the streamers come down. I mean, let's put the things together.
Those helped. And I think that you have to, in theater, always be... keep your eyes open for the mistakes, because they can be great.
Lenny, any Olympian view of the show you want to share with us?
Olympian? I don't like the overture because I didn't write it, and I still, if we were to revive it tomorrow, I would still make my pitch.
For what? For an overture?
No overture.
For no overture?
You wanted a slow prelude? You wanted a slow prelude. You still want that?
There was an overture. I don't
You
remember.
have the meanest memory, Steve Sondheim.
Why?
I just said that's it. I just said here comes the trailer.
Well, our guests today have been very generous with their time and thoughts. I'd like to open up for a little bit. So, how you doing? All right? You can give us 15 minutes? Huh? Okay. So, we'll try to see you with these lights in our eyes here. Yes, Eve.